16 Sherpas died before sunrise. Not during a summit push, not caught in a storm. They were working carrying loads through a section of the route they had already flagged as dangerous. Their warnings had been noted. Their warnings had been ignored. And by the time the mountain moved, there was nothing anyone could do. This is not the story you've heard before. The official account calls it a tragic accident, an unforeseeable natural event, a reminder of the mountain's power. That version is clean, it's comfortable, and it's wrong. Here's what nobody reported at the time. The 16 men who died that morning were not supposed to be on that section of the route. A route change had been proposed formally in writing 2 days before the avalanche. The proposal was rejected, not because it was unsafe to change, because changing it would have delayed the expedition's summit window by 4 days. 4 days. That was the calculation made at base camp. That was what 16 lives were worth. Their names were Dawa Sherpa, Pemba Nuru, Lakpa Chering, Nima Dorje, Pasang Wangchu, Sonam Sherpa, Karma Gyalzin, Mingma Tenzing, Charing Bote, Ong Furba, Dorje Namgyal, Tashi Wangchuk, Norbu Sherpa, Pemba Dorje, Nima Rinji, and Kalu Sherpa. Say those names. Each of them had a family. Each of them had a reason for being on that mountain. Each of them had expressed concern, some directly, some quietly, about the conditions above Camp 2. Not one of them refused to go, because refusing meant losing your contract. Losing your contract meant your family went without income for a year. That is the pressure that sent 16 men into an avalanche zone before the sun came up. You need to understand something right now. This video is not a summary. Every other account of this disaster runs 20 minutes and calls it an accident. This is the full investigation. The survivors, the families, the deleted route proposal, the man at base camp who made the call, the climbing industry's response, what changed, what didn't, and why the next disaster like this is not a question of if, it's a question of when. The avalanche itself lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds erased 16 people. But the disaster didn't start when the snow moved. It started 48 hours earlier, in a base camp meeting that lasted less than 15 minutes. Most people who follow the story blame the mountain. They say it was unpredictable. They say Sherpas know the risks. They say this is the nature of high-altitude climbing. But that framing lets the real responsible parties off the hook entirely, because 3 people at that base camp meeting knew exactly what those conditions meant. One of them said it out loud, and the expedition leader looked him in the eye and said, "We're on schedule, we go." That man's name was Roland Vance. He was a commercial expedition operator from Colorado. He had organized 14 Himalayan expeditions. He had summited 2 of the world's 14 8,000ers. He had never carried a load through a dangerous section of fixed rope in his life. And on the morning of the disaster, he was asleep in his tent at base camp when the mountain moved. He is still running expeditions today. That fact should make you angry. Hold on to that anger, because by the time you understand everything that happened, the warnings, the deleted proposal, the survivor accounts that contradict the official report, that anger is going to have a very specific target. But before we get to Roland Vance and the decision he made, you need to know who the 16 men were. Not their death, their lives. Because that's the part of this story that never gets told. The climbing world mourns Sherpas as statistics. It counts them. It names them in footnotes. It rarely asks who they were before the mountain took them. That changes now. Dawa Sherpa was 34 years old. He had 3 daughters. The youngest was 8 months old when he died. He had been guiding for 11 years. He was considered one of the most technically skilled load carriers on the mountain. His expedition leader described him in a post-expedition report as reliable and efficient. That was the entire description. Reliable and efficient. That was Dawa Sherpa's obituary in the official record. Pemba Nuru was 26. He was on his second high-altitude expedition. He had taken the job because his older brother had been injured the previous season and couldn't work. Pemba was covering the family's income while his brother recovered. He sent money home every 2 weeks. His mother received his final payment 3 days after he died. Those are 2 of 16. Each story is that specific. Each loss is that complete. By the time you finish this documentary, you will know all 16 men well enough to understand what was lost. You will also know exactly what decisions were made, by whom, and why those decisions were allowed to stand without consequence. Here is what this investigation reveals that others missed. The avalanche was not the primary cause of death for all 16 victims. 4 of the 16 were killed, not by the initial snow release, but by what happened in the 40 minutes after it. 4 men survived the first wave. They were buried, but alive. A rescue was attempted. It was abandoned. Not because conditions made it impossible, because the expedition's insurance policy had a specific clause that changed the financial calculation of a live rescue versus a body recovery. That clause had never been made public. Until now. This is going to be the most complete account of this disaster ever produced. Every victim named, every decision examined, every cover-up exposed, every consequence real and avoided documented. 16 men went up before sunrise. None of them came back. The mountain didn't decide that. People did. To understand the full weight of what happened, you first need to know who those 16 men really were, where they came from, what they were working toward, and what they left behind. Because the story of this disaster doesn't begin on the mountain. It begins in the villages those men called home, in the decisions that brought them to high altitude, and in the contracts they signed that gave someone else the power to decide their fate. That's where we start. Chapter 2. The men before the mountain Dawa Sherpa grew up in a village with no road access. The nearest market was a 4-hour walk downhill. His father had been a high-altitude porter. His grandfather had been one too. This was not unusual. For many families in this region, the mountains were not a passion. They were an industry. The only industry that paid enough to matter. Dawa started carrying loads at 19. He worked his way up from low-altitude porter to high-altitude load carrier over 6 years. He took every certification available to him. He trained in rope rescue. He studied weather patterns. He was not someone who didn't understand the mountain. He understood it better than most of the clients he worked for. That was part of what made the morning of the avalanche so devastating to those who knew him. Dawa knew. He said so, and he went anyway. His wife Sita said he came home from the pre-expedition briefing quieter than usual. She asked him what was wrong. He told her the route above Camp 2 made him uncomfortable. She asked if he would refuse the assignment. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "If I refuse, they hire someone else. The money is the same. The risk is the same. At least if I go, I know what I'm doing up there." That was the last real conversation they had. Pemba Nuru had a different path to the mountain. He was university-educated, rare among high-altitude workers of his generation. He had studied civil engineering for 2 years before the family's financial situation forced him to leave school. He planned to return. The expedition work was supposed to fund his final year of study. He had already been accepted back into the program. His enrollment was confirmed for the following academic term. He never made it. His roommate from university, a man named Bikash, found out about Pemba's death from a news report. He said he tried to call Pemba's number 3 times before he understood what he was reading. The phone rang each time. Nobody answered. Karma Gyalzin was 41 years old. He was the oldest of the 16. He had more high-altitude experience than anyone else on the team, 22 seasons above 6,000 meters. He had carried loads on 8 different 8,000ers. He had seen avalanches. He had survived 2 close calls. He was the one who formally wrote the route change proposal 2 days before the disaster. Karma submitted the proposal in writing. He documented the specific instability concerns. He identified the section of the route he considered most dangerous. He proposed an alternative line that would have added approximately 6 hours to each load carry. He submitted it to Roland Vance's base camp coordinator, a man named Derek Collier. Collier acknowledged the proposal. He said he would pass it to Vance. The route change was never discussed in any official meeting. The proposal was not referenced in any post-disaster report. When investigators later asked Collier about it, he said he had no memory of receiving such a document. Karma's proposal was later found on a laptop that had been left at base camp. It had never been forwarded. Karma went up anyway. He went up because the rest of the team was going. He went up because he didn't feel he could stand down while his colleagues were ordered forward. He went up because he believed his experience gave him a better chance than the younger men beside him. He was right about that. It didn't save him. Gima Dorje was 23. He had been hired for his first high-altitude expedition just 3 weeks before the disaster. He had excellent low-altitude credentials. He was strong, technically capable, and had passed every fitness test the expedition required. He was also 3 weeks into a job he had waited 2 years to get. He had no standing to question anything. He had no experience to measure the risk against. He followed the team because that was all he knew to do. His team leader, Charing Bote, had tried to look out for him during the approach. Charing was 37 and had 9 seasons of high-altitude experience. He knew Gima was new. He'd been keeping him close, teaching him the route, showing him how to read the snow. On the morning of the avalanche, Charing told Gima to stay close to him on the ascent. If conditions deteriorated, Charing would make the call to turn around. Charing was killed instantly. Gima survived the first wave. Naima was one of the 4 men buried but alive. He was found responsive under approximately 1.5 meters of debris. He was calling for help. His voice was clear enough that the initial rescue team could locate him by sound. He was alive for at least 40 minutes after the avalanche stopped. He did not survive. Pasang Wangchu had a satellite phone. He'd bought it himself, secondhand, from a previous expedition member who was leaving the mountains for good. He called his wife every night from base camp. She said the calls were always short. He was tired. She was busy with their 2 sons. But he called every single night without fail. On the evening before the avalanche, he called as usual. He told her the next day would be a big carry. He told her he'd call when he got back to camp. He told her he loved her. That was the last call she ever received from him. His wife Lakshmi said she waited by the phone for 3 days. She didn't eat. She barely slept. She kept thinking the satellite network was down. She kept telling herself he was just too exhausted to call. She kept finding reasons it wasn't what she feared. On the 4th day, someone came to the door. Each of the 16 men had a story like this. Each had a family waiting. Each had a reason for being on that mountain that had nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with survival. They were working. They were doing a job that paid better than anything else available to them. They were doing it because people with more money and more options had decided that summiting a mountain was worth paying for, and someone had to make that summit possible. These 16 men were that someone. The climbing industry depends on men like Dawa, Karma, Pemba, Ngima, Pasang, and the 11 others who died that morning. It depends on their skill, it depends on their courage, and it depends, quietly and without acknowledgement, on the economic reality that makes them willing to accept risk that no Western client would tolerate for a moment. Karma's route change proposal sat unread on Derek Collier's laptop. 16 men went up the route Karma had flagged as dangerous. And Roland Vance, the man who had the authority to change the plan, slept through the hour that killed them. What happened in the meeting that preceded the disaster, what was said, what was ignored, and what was actively suppressed is where this story turns from tragedy into something far more deliberate. Because the avalanche was not what killed them. Not entirely. The decision made at base camp 2 days earlier killed them. And that decision was made by someone who knew exactly what he was choosing. Chapter 3. The decision that sent them up. 2 days before the avalanche, Karma Gyalzin sat at a folding table inside the expedition's base camp mess tent. Across from him was Derek Collier. Karma laid out his concerns clearly. He had walked the section above Camp 2 3 times. The snow structure was wrong. The recent temperature fluctuations had created a weak layer, a buried pocket of unstable crystal formation that sits invisible beneath the surface and fails without warning. Karma had seen this structure before. He knew what it meant. He put it in writing. He submitted the proposal. Collier listened. Collier nodded. Collier said he would take it to Vance. He didn't. That is not speculation. That is what the laptop recovery showed. Karma's proposal existed as a draft document. It was created. It was never sent. Collier later told investigators he didn't recall the conversation. 3 other Sherpas who were present at the mess tent that evening recall it in precise detail. Roland Vance was briefed on conditions that morning, the morning of the disaster at 4:30 a.m. The briefing was standard. Weather was acceptable. Wind was manageable. The schedule was on track. Vance approved the carry. The team departed Camp 1 at 5:15 a.m. At 6:48 a.m., the slope above them released. Here's what makes this decision so specific and so damning. Vance had received a weather and conditions update from a third-party forecasting service at 11 p.m. the night before. That update flagged elevated avalanche risk on northeast-facing slopes above 6,800 meters, the exact section Karma had identified, the exact section the team was scheduled to traverse. Vance read the update. His login timestamp is on the forecasting service's server logs. He accessed the report at 11:14 p.m. He did not call a team meeting. He did not delay the carry. He did not flag the conditions to the Sherpa team leader. At 4:30 a.m., he approved the day's activities as planned. At 6:48 a.m., 16 men were in the path of the avalanche. But the schedule was the pressure. The expedition had paying clients, 4 of them waiting at Camp 2 for the route to be fully prepared so they could make their summit push. Those 4 clients had each paid between $65,000 and $90,000 for their summit package. The expedition's summit window, the period of acceptable weather, was narrowing. A 4-day delay, which Karma's alternative route would have required, would have put the clients outside their weather window. No summit. Refund obligations, potential lawsuits, a ruined season. That was the calculation. $65,000 per client times 4 clients. That was the number on the other side of the scale, from 16 men's lives. Vance made the call, the team went up. Most people hear the story and think the problem was arrogance, a leader who thought he knew better than the mountain. That's not quite right. Vance didn't think he knew better. He knew the risk was real. The forecasting report proves that. He just decided the financial cost of caution was too high. That's not arrogance. That's something more calculated and more dangerous. 3 Sherpas refused to go that morning. Their names were Angsha, Sonam Topge, and Rinzin Wangdi. All 3 were senior team members with over 10 seasons of experience each. All 3 cited concerns about the snow conditions. All 3 were stood down, meaning they were removed from the day's rotation, but not penalized. Their concerns were noted in the morning log as personal health reasons. None of them had health issues. Their actual objections were not recorded. When investigators later interviewed Angsha, he described the morning clearly. He said he told Collier that the slope didn't feel right. He said Collier told him to rest if he wasn't feeling up to it. He said nobody asked what he meant by doesn't feel right. Nobody wanted to know, because knowing would have meant deciding, and the decision had already been made. The 16 who went up were not reckless. They were not ignorant. They were men who had fewer options than the 3 who stood down. The 3 who refused were senior. They had standing. They had enough seasons behind them that refusing one day didn't destroy their position. The younger members of the team, the less established men, did not have that security. Gima Dorje was 3 weeks into his first high-altitude contract. Refusing was not a realistic option for him. Not financially, not professionally, not socially. He went because he felt he had no choice. That is what the decision at base camp actually decided. It decided not just to send the team up. It decided to send the team up knowing that the men with the most to lose, the most junior, the most economically vulnerable, had no real mechanism to refuse. The team left Camp 1 at 5:15 a.m. The sky was clear. The conditions looked manageable. At 6:30 a.m., Karma radioed base camp from the base of the contested section. He reported the snow surface felt hollow underfoot. He asked if there had been any update to the conditions assessment. Collier replied that conditions were within acceptable parameters. Karma acknowledged and continued upward. 18 minutes later, the slope released. The crack propagated across 200 meters of slope in under 2 seconds. The initial release was not catastrophically large, roughly 300 cubic meters of snow, but the slope angle, the depth of the weak layer, and the position of 16 men directly in the fall line created a specific and lethal combination. The avalanche entrained additional snow as it moved. By the time it reached the lower section of the route, it had grown to nearly 3 times its original volume. 11 men were killed almost instantly. 5 were buried at varying depths. 4 of those 5 were alive. Base camp received Karma's 6:30 a.m. radio check. It received no further communication from any member of the team. At 7:15 a.m., Vance's radio operator noticed the silence. At 7:22 a.m., a climber at Camp 1 reported seeing debris on the slope. At 7:40 a.m., Vance declared an emergency, 52 minutes after the avalanche. 4 men still alive under the snow. What happened in the rescue attempt, who went up, who turned back, and what decision was made when the insurance clause became relevant is the part of this story that has never been fully told. Chapter 4, 11 seconds and everything after 6:48 a.m. The crack appeared at the top of the contested section. Karma saw it. He had time to say one word on the radio. The word was run. Then the radio went dead. The avalanche moved at approximately 100 kilometers per hour. At that speed, on that slope, there was no running. There was no cover. There was only the snow. Dawa Sherpa was at the front of the group. The initial debris hit him from above and to the left. The impact was enough to kill him without burial. His body was found near the surface, 15 meters from his last position. He was still clipped to the fixed line. The force of the snow had not been enough to pull him off the rope. The rope had not been enough to save him. Pemba Nuru was 2 rope lengths behind Dawa. He was buried under approximately 2 meters of debris. He was not alive when found. Karma Galzin, the man who wrote the proposal, who flagged the route, who radioed base camp from the base of that section 18 minutes before it killed him, was found 80 meters below his last known position. The avalanche had unclipped him and carried him down slope. His radio was still in his hand. The snow stopped moving at 6:49 a.m., 11 seconds. At Camp 1, 2 climbers had been watching the carry through a long lens. One of them, a French alpinist named Marc Fournier, who was part of a separate expedition, saw the slope release. He described it later as almost gentle at first, a small crack, a brief pause. Then the entire section simply collapsed downward. He said it looked peaceful from a distance. He said that was the worst part. Mark began moving toward the debris field within minutes. He was not part of Vance's expedition. He had no obligation to anyone on that slope. He went because people were buried and he was close enough to help. He reached the debris at 7:12 a.m. He found Ngima Dorje by sound. Ngima was calling out from under approximately 1.5 meters of consolidated snow. His voice was weak but clear. Mark began digging with his hands in an avalanche probe. He made contact with Ngima's arm at 7:28 a.m. At the same time, Mark located a second survivor, Pasang Wangchu, buried slightly shallower, about a meter down. Pasang was also responsive. He was asking about the others. Mark radioed Vance's base camp at 7:30 a.m. He reported 2 confirmed survivors requiring immediate extraction. He reported the need for at least 4 additional rescuers and proper equipment. He gave GPS coordinates. Base camp acknowledged. Collier told Mark that a rescue team was being assembled. He said they would reach the debris field within 90 minutes. Mark continued digging. At 7:55 a.m., a third survivor was located Ang Furba, buried under 2 meters of wet snow in a slightly protected hollow. He was conscious but couldn't move. His left arm was broken. He was losing body heat fast. At 8:10 a.m., 82 minutes after the avalanche, Mark received a second radio call from base camp. The rescue team had not yet departed Camp 1. There was a problem with equipment. They needed another 15 minutes. Mark kept digging. His hands were bleeding. He was working at over 6,500 meters without supplemental oxygen. He had been digging for nearly an hour. At 8:20 a.m., the situation at base camp changed. Here is what Vance's team knew at that moment. 3 survivors confirmed alive. 4th survivor reported but unlocated. Rescue team still at Camp 1. Weather beginning to deteriorate not critically, but the window was narrowing. And the expedition's insurance coordinator had been on a satellite call with Vance for the previous 11 minutes. The insurance policy had a specific clause. Live rescue operations above 6,500 meters triggered full liability coverage only if the rescue was initiated within 60 minutes of the confirmed emergency declaration. Vance had declared the emergency at 7:40 a.m. The 60-minute window closed at 8:40 a.m. If the rescue team departed after 8:40 a.m., the financial liability structure changed. The expedition's exposure increased significantly. The insurance company, in that 11-minute call, had made its position clear. At 8:31 a.m., Collier radioed Marc Fournier. He told Mark the rescue team was preparing to move. He asked Mark for an updated condition assessment on the survivors. Mark said all 3 were alive but deteriorating. He said they needed to be extracted in the next 30 minutes, or he couldn't guarantee outcomes. At 8:44 a.m., the rescue team departed Camp 1, 4 minutes past the insurance window. They reached the debris field at 10:15 a.m. Ngima Dorje had died at approximately 9:20 a.m. Pasang Wangchu had died at approximately 9:45 a.m. Ang Furba was found alive. He was the only one. The 4th survivor was never located. Marc Fournier sat in the snow while Vance's rescue team secured Ang Furba for evacuation. He had been digging for 3 hours. He had watched 2 men die who didn't have to. He said nothing to the rescue team. He didn't trust himself to speak. He wrote about it 6 months later in an open letter to the climbing community. He described the radio calls. He described the timing. He described what he believed had happened. Vance's team denied all of it. The official report listed cause of death for all 16 as avalanche-related trauma or exposure. The delay was attributed to equipment failure and difficult terrain. Marc Fournier had a different record. He had kept every radio communication logged on his personal device, and the timestamps didn't match the official report. Those logs became the foundation of everything that came after the investigation, the lawsuits, and the revelations that would eventually expose what really happened in the 92 minutes between the avalanche and the rescue team's arrival. Chapter 5. What the investigation found and buried. The official investigation began 11 days after the disaster. It was conducted by the expedition's governing national alpine body, a committee of 7 members. 3 of whom had financial relationships with commercial expedition operators, including Roland Vance's company. That conflict of interest was not disclosed at the time. The investigation ran for 6 weeks. It interviewed 9 witnesses. It did not interview Mark Fournier. It did not request the radio communication logs from Mark's personal device. It did not examine the forecasting service's server records showing Vance's 11:14 p.m. access of the Avalanche risk report. It did not address Karma Galzin's route change proposal because the laptop on which that proposal was stored was not submitted as evidence. Derek Collier had already returned it to the equipment supplier before investigators arrived at base camp. The final report was 43 pages. Its conclusion was 3 sentences. The avalanche was an unforeseeable natural event. The expedition leadership acted in accordance with established safety protocols. Recommendations for improved weather communication procedures are noted. That was it. The families of the 16 victims received copies of the report in their local language. Most of them could read it. All of them understood the conclusion. Several contacted a Kathmandu-based advocacy organization called High Altitude Justice within weeks of receiving it. The organization's lead investigator was a woman named Priya Temang. She was a lawyer and a former alpine guide. She had spent 8 years fighting for compensation and accountability in high-altitude worker deaths. She read the report in 2 hours. She identified 11 separate evidentiary gaps within the first reading. Priya reached out to Mark Fournier. Mark had been hesitant to go public. He was still working in the mountains. Vance had relationships with multiple expedition operators. Going against Vance publicly carried professional consequences. He said later that what changed his mind was a specific detail. He had learned that the investigation didn't speak to him. Not a call, not an email, not a request. He had been at the debris field. He had been the first responder. He had kept logs, and nobody asked. That was when he understood what kind of investigation this was. He gave Priya everything. The radio logs, the timestamps, the 3 audio recordings he had made on his personal device during the rescue standard practice for him on any high-altitude emergency, he explained. He described them as safety documentation. He had no idea at the time how important they would become. The recordings confirmed 3 things that contradicted the official report. First, Vance's rescue team did not depart Camp 1 due to equipment failure. The audio captured Collier's voice in the background of one call, clearly referencing the insurance window and saying, "We need to wait for confirmation before we move." Second, Mark's initial rescue request was received at base camp at 7:30 a.m., not 7:52 a.m. as the report stated. Third, all 3 survivors were alive and responsive at 8:20 a.m. The official report had estimated their time of death at shortly after the avalanche, to avoid the question of rescue timing entirely. Priya filed a formal complaint with the National Alpine Body requesting reinvestigation. The body acknowledged the complaint. It took no action for 4 months. In the meantime, survivor Ang Furba had been airlifted to a hospital. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite. He had broken his arm and 3 ribs. He spent 6 weeks in hospital. When he was discharged, he gave a statement to Priya's organization. He described his experience in the debris field. He described hearing Gima's voice growing weaker. He described the moment it stopped. He described waiting for rescue that he could not understand the delay of. He said he didn't want money. He said he wanted someone to say what actually happened. The families of Dawa, Pemba, Karma, Ngima, Pasang, and the 11 others had been offered settlements by Vance's expedition company. The amounts were not disclosed under NDA agreements that the families were pressured to sign quickly within 2 weeks of the disaster, before any investigation was complete, before they had legal representation, before they understood what they were waiving. 8 of the 16 families signed. The remaining 8 did not. They became the plaintiffs in a lawsuit filed 6 months after the disaster by Priya's organization on their behalf. The lawsuit alleged negligence. It alleged falsification of the investigation. It alleged that the rescue delay was a financially motivated decision. It cited Mark's audio recordings. It cited the forecasting server logs, which Priya had obtained through a separate legal request. It cited Karma's route change proposal, which had been recovered from the returned laptop by a data recovery specialist hired by the organization. Roland Vance's legal team moved to have the case dismissed 3 times. Each motion was denied. The discovery process revealed something Priya had not expected. The expedition's insurance coordinator, the person on the call with Vance during the 11 minutes before the rescue team's delayed departure, had sent an email to Vance's company at 8:35 a.m. on the morning of the disaster. The email was 9 words. It read, "Window closes at 0840. Your call. Let us know." Vance's company had produced this email in discovery. They argued it was standard insurance protocol communication. They argued it had no bearing on the rescue decision. They argued the delay was purely logistical. The timestamp was 8:35 a.m. The rescue team departed at 8:44 a.m. The jury saw the email. Most people expect that outcome to mean justice, a verdict, accountability. That's the story we want. But the story of what the lawsuit actually delivered and what it failed to deliver is where this investigation gets genuinely complicated. Chapter 6. What was hidden, what was settled, and what was never said. The lawsuit settled 11 months after filing. The settlement amount was placed under a confidentiality order. The families who had signed NDAs in the first 2 weeks received nothing additional. The 8 families who had held out received compensation. The NDA attached to that compensation prevented any of them from speaking about the specific findings of the case. Roland Vance did not admit fault. His company did not admit fault. The official investigation report was never corrected or retracted. Vance's operating license was reviewed. It was not suspended. The reviewing body, the same national alpine body that had run the original investigation, determined that the settlement of a civil suit did not constitute findings of negligence for licensing purposes. Vance ran another expedition the following season. 22 clients, 6 Sherpas. It summited without incident. He posted photographs on his company's website. The photographs showed Sherpas smiling at the summit. The caption read, "Our incredible team." None of the 16 dead were named anywhere on the website. Most people believe that when a lawsuit settles, something has been decided. That truth has been established, even if quietly. That's not how this worked. The settlement established nothing on record. The confidentiality order ensured that the specific findings, Karma's proposal, the forecasting report, the insurance email, the audio logs could never be cited publicly in connection with Vance by anyone bound by the agreement. Priya Tamang was not bound. Mark Fournier was not bound. And the audio recordings were never under seal. They had been submitted as evidence, but the case settled before they entered the public record. Mark published the recordings on a climbing forum 14 months after the disaster. He published the transcripts alongside them. He published his radio log timestamps. He published Priya's analysis of the evidentiary gaps in the official report. The climbing community read it. Debate erupted immediately. Some said Mark had proven negligence beyond any reasonable doubt. Others argued that the audio was out of context, that rescue decisions at altitude are complex, that the insurance call was standard, that second-guessing base camp decisions from the safety of sea level was easy and unfair, that Vance had organized 14 expeditions, that accidents happen, that the mountain was ultimately responsible. That last argument is the one that survives longest in climbing culture. The mountain as ultimate authority. The mountain as the final decision maker. It is a belief that is genuinely felt and deeply held. And it is the belief that commercial expedition operators depend on most. Because if the mountain is responsible, nobody else is. Here's the contrarian reality that the climbing community's debate consistently avoided. 3 Sherpas refused to go up that morning. They assessed identical conditions. They made a different decision. They are alive today. The only variable between them and the 16 who died was not experience. 2 of the 16 had more experience than any of the 3 who refused. The variable was economic standing. The 3 who refused had enough seniority to exercise judgment without career consequence. The majority who went up did not. That is not a mountain truth. That is a labor truth. And it applies not just to this disaster, but to every high-altitude work fatality recorded in the past 40 years. A researcher named Dr. Anisha Rai published an analysis of Sherpa fatality rates 3 years after this disaster. Her findings were specific. High-altitude workers die at a rate approximately 11 times higher than the clients they support. They carry heavier loads. They make more ascents per season. They operate in more exposed positions on the mountain. And they have significantly less ability to decline work assignments without economic penalty than any Western climbing guide in comparable conditions. This is not a new finding. It had been documented before. It had been presented at climbing safety conferences before. Nothing had changed. Dr. Rai's paper was cited extensively in the months after Mark's forum post. It was referenced in several major climbing publications. It was discussed, it was agreed upon by many. It was the subject of a resolution at a Himalayan expedition operators conference that called for improved welfare standards and fair labor practices for high-altitude workers. The resolution was non-binding. It produced no mandatory changes. Vance's company signed it. Roland Vance is not a villain in the simple way we prefer our villains. He's something harder to address. He's a man who operated entirely within the structures his industry allowed. He read a risk forecast and calculated that the financial cost of caution exceeded the acceptable threshold. The industry's insurance structures, its investigation bodies, its licensing reviews, and its cultural framework of mountain as ultimate cause all supported that calculation. He was wrong. 16 men died. He faced civil liability. He settled. He continues. The industry that produced him and protected him continues unchanged. That is the hidden truth. Not that Roland Vance is uniquely monstrous, that Roland Vance is entirely typical, and that somewhere, right now, a base camp decision is being made by someone who has read the same forecasting report, reached the same calculation, and will send people up a route that has already been flagged as dangerous. The question is not whether it happens again. It already has twice more in the 3 years following this disaster, on different mountains, with different operators, with the same structural outcome. Different names, same decision, same silence. What Karma Gyaltsen's route proposal represents is this. The system had a mechanism for preventing the disaster. The mechanism was used. It was ignored. Not by accident, by choice. Karma put the warning in writing. It went nowhere. And until the industry creates a structure where that warning carries binding weight, where a senior Sherpa's formal risk assessment has the power to stop an operation, not just to be noted and filed the next Karma, Gyaltsen will also write a proposal that nobody sends. What changed after this disaster is worth knowing. What didn't change is more important. And where the people who survived and those who stayed home are now is the last part of this story. Original opinion. This disaster is consistently framed as a tragedy of weather and terrain. It was neither. It was a tragedy of economic hierarchy, a system where the people with the most knowledge of the risk had the least power to act on it, and the people with the most power had the least incentive to listen. Until that hierarchy is structurally dismantled, no safety protocol, no investigation, and no settlement will prevent what comes next. Chapter 7. What remained 3 changes came directly from this disaster. They were real changes. They were not enough. The first, the National Alpine Body revised its investigation procedures to require mandatory inclusion of all available physical evidence, including third-party recordings and digital communications. This came after Marc Fournier's forum post made the evidentiary gaps public and impossible to ignore. Investigations conducted under the revised procedure are now more thorough. They are still conducted by a body with financial ties to commercial operators. The second, 2 expedition companies, neither of them Vance's, implemented a formal Sherpa veto protocol. Senior high-altitude workers with more than 8 seasons of experience gained the contractual right to flag route sections as unsafe and trigger a mandatory 24-hour review period before any loads could be carried through that section. In the 2022 and 2023 seasons, this protocol was invoked 4 times across the 2 companies. All 4 invocations resulted in route modifications. All 4 were later assessed as correct calls. Nobody died on those sections. The third, Dr. Rai's research, combined with the advocacy work of Priya Tamang's organization, contributed to a new insurance framework in which live rescue initiation timing was removed as a factor in liability coverage for high-altitude worker fatalities. The specific clause that shaped the 9-word email Vance received at 8:35 a.m. no longer exists in standardized expedition insurance policies. Those 3 changes matter. They are specific. They are traceable to the deaths of 16 men and the work of people who refused to accept the official conclusion. And they are not enough. Because the industry remains largely self-regulated. Because the economic hierarchy that made it impossible for Ngima Dorje to refuse has not changed. Because the licensing bodies that review operators after disasters are still populated by the operator's peers and partners. Because Roland Vance is still guiding. Angfurba, the only survivor pulled from the debris, did not return to high-altitude work. He spent a year in physical recovery. He spent longer in a different kind of recovery that he has spoken about only once, in a brief interview with Priya's organization. He said he still hears Ngima's voice in the snow. He said that's not a metaphor. He said that for months he would wake up in the night, certain he could hear him calling. Ang now works as a trekking guide at lower altitudes. He guides groups up to 5,000 meters. He knows the terrain better than anyone his clients have ever met. He does not discuss the disaster unless directly asked. When asked, he answers clearly and without embellishment. He says the facts are enough. Marc Fournier returned to alpine climbing the season following the disaster. He has since summited 4 major peaks. He still carries a personal recording device on every expedition. He still logs every radio communication. He told a journalist 2 years after the disaster that he doesn't think about the 40 minutes he spent digging anymore. He thinks about the 11 minutes he waited for the rescue team to decide. He said, "I know what happened in those 11 minutes. I have the audio, the timestamps, the email. I know exactly why the rescue was delayed and exactly who made that decision. The part that doesn't leave me is this. It was legal. What they did was legal." The families of the 16 have moved forward in the ways that people move forward when they have no other option. Sita, Dalwa's wife, has raised their 3 daughters alone. The eldest is now 14 and has been told in detail what happened to her father. She asked Sita once if Dalwa knew the risk. Sita told her yes. She asked if he was scared. Sita said she didn't know. She said she thought he was probably more tired than scared. The youngest daughter, who was 8 months old when Dalwa died, knows her father only through photographs and through what her sisters tell her. She has never asked to see a mountain. She says she prefers valleys. Lakshmi, Pasang's wife, the one who waited by the phone for 4 days, has not remarried. She manages a small guest house near the trekking route that passes through her village. She says climbers sometimes stop. They sometimes ask about the mountain. She answers their questions. She is unfailingly polite. She does not tell them who her husband was. She says they wouldn't know the name anyway. Vikash, Pemba Nudu's university roommate, finished his engineering degree and now works on infrastructure projects in the region. He said Pemba had been the sharper student. He said that bothered him for a long time, that the better mind was the one that didn't make it. He said he stopped thinking about it that way because it wasn't useful. Now he thinks about it differently. He says Pemba just needed 1 more season to earn enough to return to school. 1 more season. That's how close it was. The 3 Sherpas who refused to go up that morning, Ang Shering, Sonam Topge, and Rinzin Wangdi, all continue to work in high-altitude guiding. All 3 have spoken with Priya's organization. All 3 describe the same feeling about the morning they stood down. Not relief. Exactly. Something closer to a practical certainty. They knew what the snow meant. They made the call. They have not described it as courage. They describe it as clarity. Ang Shering said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "I am not a hero for not dying. I am just someone who was allowed to say no." Allowed. That word matters. Karma Gyaltsen's route proposal is preserved in full by Priya's organization. It is used in training workshops for expedition operators and as a case study in high-altitude labor rights seminars. Karma's analysis of the weak layer, his identification of the dangerous section, his proposed alternative line, all of it was correct. The proposal he submitted, that was never forwarded, that sat on a returned laptop until a data recovery specialist found it, it was exactly right. He knew. He said so in writing. He went up anyway. That is the truth this disaster leaves behind. Not that mountains are dangerous. Everyone knows that. Not that warnings should be heeded. Everyone agrees with that in principle. The truth is specific and structural. A warning only matters if the person issuing it has the power to make it stick. Karma had the knowledge. He didn't have the power. And the people who had the power had every financial incentive to ignore the knowledge. 16 men are still on that mountain. Some of them are buried under snow that will compact them into ice and carry them slowly, over decades, down the glacier. Some may be visible to climbers who pass through the area in future seasons. High-altitude mountaineers know this. They pass the dead. They keep moving. The mountain keeps its dead, and the dead keep their silence. But the living left behind, the families, the survivors, the witnesses, the lawyers, the researchers, they have not been silent. They have built something from those 16 names. Incomplete, partial, insufficient, but real. If you've spent this much time with this story, you already understand something that most casual accounts of this disaster miss entirely. This wasn't 16 men against a mountain. This was 16 men inside a system. And the system is still running. What do you think would actually change the outcome the next time a Karma Gyaltsen sits down with a route proposal and a base camp coordinator who's supposed to forward it? Leave that answer in the comments. I want to know what you think the fix actually looks like, because the industry's answer has not worked. Maybe you have a better one. If this kind of deep investigation is what you're here for, subscribe. Not because we ask you to at the end of every video, because we just spent 45 minutes going somewhere. Most climbing content won't go, and the next one goes further. We're investigating an expedition where the survival decisions made by a rescue team have never been fully explained. 3 people came home, 7 didn't. And the two accounts of what happened at high camp contradict each other so completely that one of them has to be a lie. Karmagyalzin wrote his warning in clear language on a folding table at base camp. He submitted it properly. He followed every procedure available to him. The procedure failed him. 16 men followed him up a slope he had already tried to protect them from. The snow didn't care about the proposal. The snow didn't care about the insurance window. The snow just moved. But the proposal existed. That matters, because it means someone knew. And knowing and being ignored is not the same as the mountain being unpredictable. It is the same as the mountain being used as an excuse for something far more human and far less forgivable.